Imagine waking up one day and discovering that two nations who once worked side by side now stand as bitter enemies, locked in decades of tension, threats, and near war. How did it happen? How did the friendship between the United States and Iran collapse so completely that today they see each other as mortal rivals? Was it a secret coup, a revolution that shook the world, or a hostage crisis that humiliated a superpower? Behind the headlines lies a story of power, betrayal, fear, and revolution. A story that began long before missiles, sanctions, and nuclear tensions. In the next few minutes, we'll uncover the dramatic chain of events. We'll uncover the dramatic chain of events that turned two nations into arch enemies and changed the course of Middle Eastern history forever. Stay with me, because this story is far more shocking than most people realize. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. The story of how the United States and Iran became bitter enemies is not a story of a single war or a single decision. It is a story of betrayal, revolution, fear, and power, a story written across decades of coups, protests, sanctions, and shadow wars. To understand why these two nations glare at each other across the Middle East today, we must go back, not to a battlefield, but to a moment when they were once friends. The days of friendship in the years after World War II. The United States and Iran were not enemies. In fact, they were allies. Iran sat at a strategic crossroads between the Soviet Union and the oil-rich Middle East. For Washington, it was a crucial partner in the Cold War. For Iran, American support promised modernization and protection. The ruler of Iran at the time was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah. Backed by Western support, the Shah pushed Iran toward rapid modernization, building industries, expanding the military, and aligning closely with the United States. For a time, the relationship seemed unbreakable, but beneath the surface, resentment was already growing, and it centered on one word: oil. The coup that changed everything, 1953, in the early 1950s. Iran elected a nationalist prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was wildly popular. He made a bold decision that electrified the Iranian people. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, taking control away from foreign companies that had long profited from Iranian resources. To Iranians, it was an act of national pride. To Britain and the United States, it was a dangerous threat. Western leaders feared that instability in Iran could open the door to Soviet influence during the Cold War. So in 1953, American and British intelligence launched a covert operation known as Operation Ajax. The CIA helped orchestrate a coup that overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah to power. For Washington, it was a strategic victory. For millions of Iranians, it was something else entirely. It was the moment democracy was stolen. And from that moment on, many Iranians began to see the United States not as a friend, but as a foreign power manipulating their destiny. The Shah's iron rule. After the coup, the Shah ruled Iran with increasing authority. His government was supported heavily by the United States militarily, economically, and politically. Iran became one of America's strongest allies in the Middle East, but inside the country, anger was growing. The Shah's secret police, SAVAK, silenced opposition. Political dissent was crushed, and many Iranians believed their ruler served Washington's interests more than Iran's own people. By the late 1970s, the streets of Tehran were boiling with protests. Students, clerics, workers, and ordinary citizens poured into the streets. What began as demonstrations soon turned into something much larger, a revolution. The Iranian Revolution, 1979. In 1979, the Shah's regime collapsed. The monarchy that had ruled Iran for decades fell almost overnight. In its place rose a powerful religious movement led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The revolution transformed Iran into an Islamic republic, and it transformed the United States from ally into enemy number one. The revolutionaries believed America had propped up a dictator and interfered in Iran's sovereignty. But the breaking point came just months later. The hostage crisis. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They captured more than 60 Americans and held 52 of them hostage for 444 days. The images shocked the world. Blindfolded diplomats, burning American flags, crowds chanting "Death to America." For Americans, it was humiliation and outrage. For revolutionary Iran, it was revenge for decades of perceived American interference. Diplomatic relations collapsed. Sanctions began. Trust vanished completely. From that point on, the relationship between the United States and Iran became a Cold War of its own. Decades of shadow conflict. The years that followed were marked not by open war, but by constant confrontation. Iran-backed militant groups across the Middle East. The United States responded with sanctions, military pressure, and alliances with Iran's regional rivals. The hostility deepened with each new crisis. In 2002, U.S. President George W. Bush labeled Iran part of the axis of evil. Iran accelerated its controversial nuclear program. Sanctions crippled the Iranian economy. In 2015, there was a brief moment of hope when the nuclear deal was signed under Barack Obama, but that fragile agreement collapsed a few years later. Then tensions exploded again in 2020 when the United States killed Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani in a drone strike. The world held its breath. Many feared a full-scale war was about to begin. The legacy of distrust today, the United States and Iran remain locked in a struggle shaped by decades of history. For Americans, Iran is a regime that sponsors militant groups and threatens regional stability. For many Iranians, America is the power that once overthrew their government and interfered in their nation's destiny. Both narratives are powerful. Both are deeply emotional, and both are rooted in real events that changed history. The tragedy of two nations. What makes this story so tragic is that it did not begin with hatred. It began with cooperation, with diplomacy, with a belief that two very different nations could work together. But history, like war, often turns on moments of fear, pride, and miscalculation. A coup, a revolution, a hostage crisis, each event pushing the two nations further apart, until eventually, friendship became rivalry, and rivalry became hostility. Today, across the waters of the Persian Gulf, the United States and Iran still watch each other carefully. Their conflict is not simply about weapons or politics. It is about memory, about the stories each nation tells itself about the past. And until those memories change, the shadow of history will continue to stand between them. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. In the early 1950s, Iran stood at a turning point in its modern history. The nation was filled with hope, pride, and a growing belief that it could finally control its own destiny. At the center of this movement was a determined and deeply respected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh. A nationalist and a passionate defender of Iranian sovereignty, Mossadegh had risen to power through democratic means and quickly became one of the most popular figures in the country's history. To many Iranians, he represented dignity, independence, and the possibility of freedom from decades of foreign domination. For decades before Mossadegh's rise, Iran's vast oil wealth had largely been controlled by foreign interests, especially the powerful Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The company, heavily backed by the government of United Kingdom, dominated Iran's oil production and reaped enormous profits, while ordinary Iranians saw very little benefit from their own natural resources. Oil fields pumped millions of barrels, yet poverty remained widespread across Iran. The imbalance created a deep sense of injustice among the Iranian people. Many believed that their country's most valuable asset had been taken from them when Mossadegh became prime minister in 1951. He made a bold and historic decision that electrified the nation. He moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry, placing it under Iranian control and ending the monopoly of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. For millions of Iranians, the moment felt like the reclaiming of their national pride. Crowds filled the streets celebrating what they saw as a long overdue act of justice. Mossadegh became a symbol of resistance against foreign influence and a champion of economic independence. But what appeared to be a moment of triumph inside Iran created alarm in the capitals of the Western world. Leaders in London were furious at the loss of their lucrative oil interests. Britain responded by imposing economic pressure, and organizing an international boycott of Iranian oil, hoping to force Mossadegh to reverse his decision. Tankers stopped coming, revenue dried up, the Iranian economy began to suffer under the weight of isolation. At the same time, the global political climate was tense and unpredictable. The world was deep in the shadow of the Cold War, a geopolitical struggle between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. Iran's geographic position made it strategically vital. It sat directly along the southern border of the Soviet sphere, and Western leaders feared that instability in Iran might open the door to communist influence. As Iran's economic crisis deepened, some American officials began to worry that Mossadegh's government might eventually fall into the orbit of the Soviet Union. In Washington, policymakers debated the situation intensely. The United States had initially viewed Mossadegh with cautious respect, but as tensions escalated and Britain pushed for stronger action, American attitudes began to shift. Concerns about oil supplies mixed with fears about Soviet expansion. Slowly, the idea began to take shape that Mossadegh had become a risk to Western strategic interests. Behind closed doors, plans began to form. The Central Intelligence Agency in the United States and Britain's MI6 started working together on a covert operation that would dramatically reshape Iran's political future. The plan was secret, complex, and deeply controversial. It would become known as Operation Ajax. The goal was simple but dangerous: remove Mossadegh from power and strengthen the rule of Iran's monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was viewed as more favorable to Western interests. The Shah had already been Iran's ruler, but his authority had weakened as Mossadegh's popularity grew. Western planners believed that restoring the Shah's full power would stabilize the country, protect their strategic priorities. The operation began quietly in 1953. Money was secretly distributed to political figures, military officers, and street organizers. Propaganda campaigns spread rumors and accusations designed to weaken Mossadegh's reputation. Newspapers published stories portraying him as unstable and dangerous. Paid demonstrators filled the streets with protests both supporting and opposing him, creating an atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty. At first, the plan did not go smoothly. Early attempts to remove Mossadegh failed, and the Shah himself became frightened by the unfolding events. In a dramatic moment of panic, he fled the country, leaving Iran temporarily without its monarch. For a brief period, it appeared that Mossadegh might survive the crisis and emerge even stronger, but the conspirators did not give up. They intensified their efforts, mobilizing loyal military units and organizing larger demonstrations. On the streets of Tehran, tensions exploded into open confrontation. Crowds clashed, soldiers moved through the city, and the political situation spiraled into turmoil. Finally, in August 1953, the balance shifted. Military forces, loyal to the Shah, surrounded Mossadegh's residence. Fighting broke out as the prime minister's supporters tried to defend him. By the end of the day, the government had collapsed. Mossadegh was arrested and later placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. The Shah returned to Iran in triumph, his authority now firmly backed by Western support. For the United States and Britain, the operation was considered a strategic success. They had protected their interests and ensured that Iran remained aligned with the Western Bloc during the Cold War. But inside Iran, the consequences were far more complex and lasting. While the Shah regained power, many Iranians believed their democracy had been deliberately destroyed by foreign interference. The removal of Mossadegh became a powerful symbol of humiliation and betrayal. Stories of the covert operation spread over time, reinforcing the belief that outside powers had manipulated Iran's political destiny. Over the following years, the Shah ruled with increasing authority, supported by military aid and political backing from the United States. His government pursued modernization and economic development, but it also relied heavily on repression to silence critics. The secret police monitored dissent, and opposition voices were often imprisoned or forced into exile. The memory of Mossadegh's fall never disappeared. For many Iranians, it became a wound that shaped how they viewed the United States for generations. The idea that a foreign intelligence operation had overthrown a democratically elected leader created a narrative of injustice that would echo throughout Iranian society. Students, religious leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens continued to debate the events of 1953, seeing them as proof that powerful nations would intervene whenever their interests were threatened. Over time, resentment toward the United States grew quietly beneath the surface of Iranian politics. Years later, when revolutionary movements began to challenge the Shah's rule, the story of Mossadegh resurfaced as a powerful reminder of what many Iranians believed had been stolen from them. The coup became more than just a political event. It became a symbol of lost sovereignty, a lesson about foreign influence, and a turning point that forever altered how Iran would view its relationship with the outside world. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join that space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. After the dramatic events of 1953, power in Iran became firmly centered in the hands of the monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The coup that removed Mohammad Mossadegh had reshaped Iran's political landscape, and the Shah returned to his throne, determined to strengthen his authority and transform the country into a modern regional power. Backed strongly by the United States and its Western allies, the Shah began building a state that looked increasingly toward the West for its political alliances, military strength, and economic development. During this period, the global atmosphere was dominated by the rivalry of the Cold War. The world was divided between two competing blocs, led by the United States and the Soviet Union. Iran's geographic position made it extremely valuable in this geopolitical contest. Sitting just south of the Soviet border and positioned at the gateway to the Persian Gulf, Iran became one of the most important strategic partners for Washington in the Middle East. American leaders believed that maintaining a strong, stable government in Iran was essential to preventing Soviet influence from spreading deeper into the region. With this strategic importance in mind, the United States began investing heavily in Iran's military and economic systems. American advisors arrived to help modernize Iran's armed forces, and advanced weapons systems began flowing into the country. The Shah envisioned transforming Iran into one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East. Tanks, aircraft, and sophisticated defense equipment strengthened Iran's army and air force, turning the country into a major regional ally of the Western world. The Shah also pursued ambitious plans to modernize Iranian society. In the early 1960s, he launched a sweeping reform program known as the White Revolution. This initiative aimed to reshape Iran's economy and social structure through rapid modernization. Land reforms attempted to break the power of large landowners and redistribute land to peasants. Education programs expanded literacy across rural areas. Infrastructure projects built roads, factories, and modern institutions intended to push Iran into a new era of development. On the surface, the transformation appeared dramatic. Cities grew rapidly as industries expanded, and oil revenues poured into the national economy. Tehran began to resemble a modern international capital, filled with new highways, modern buildings, universities, and cultural institutions. Western music, fashion, and media became increasingly visible in urban life. The Shah envisioned Iran as a bridge between East and West, a nation that combined ancient Persian heritage with modern global progress. At the same time, the government pushed for social reforms that were unprecedented in many parts of the region. Women were granted expanded rights, including the right to vote and greater access to education and professional careers. Universities flourished, and new generations of Iranian students entered fields such as engineering, medicine, and science. The Shah frequently presented these changes as proof that Iran was becoming a modern and progressive nation, aligned with Western values. Despite these developments, beneath the surface of modernization, there were growing tensions that the government struggled to contain. Many Iranians felt that the pace of change was being imposed from above without genuine participation from the public. Traditional religious leaders worried that Western cultural influences were eroding Iran's Islamic identity. Rural communities often felt disconnected from the rapid urban development occurring in major cities. Economic growth also created sharp inequalities. While oil wealth fueled grand construction projects and luxury lifestyles for the elite, many ordinary citizens continued to struggle with poverty and limited opportunities. Wealth became concentrated among those closely connected to the royal court and political establishment. For some Iranians, modernization seemed to benefit only a small segment of society. Political opposition to the Shah was extremely limited because his government maintained strict control over public life. One of the most powerful instruments of this control was the secret police organization known as Savak, established with assistance from Western intelligence services. Savak became one of the most feared institutions in Iran. Its agents monitored political activity, infiltrated opposition groups, and suppressed dissent across the country. Critics of the monarchy risked surveillance, imprisonment, or exile. Newspapers faced censorship, and political parties had little room to operate freely. Many Iranians began to feel that their country's modernization was occurring without political freedom. The state's emphasis on stability and loyalty to the monarchy often meant that dissenting voices were treated as threats rather than participants in national debate. Religious leaders were among the most vocal critics of the Shah's policies. One cleric in particular, Ruhollah Khomeini, emerged as a powerful opponent of the government. Khomeini criticized the Shah for what he saw as blind loyalty to Western powers and for reforms that he believed undermined Islamic traditions. His speeches condemned the growing influence of the United States in Iranian politics and warned that Iran was losing control over its cultural and political identity. The Shah's government responded harshly to these criticisms. Khomeini was eventually arrested and later forced into exile, but his message continued to circulate among religious networks and opposition groups inside Iran. His warnings about foreign influence and political repression resonated with many Iranians who already felt uneasy about the direction of the country. Meanwhile, the Shah's close relationship with the United States remained one of the defining features of Iran's foreign policy. Washington viewed Iran as a pillar of stability in the Middle East and a crucial ally against Soviet expansion. American presidents maintained strong ties with the Iranian monarchy, and economic partnerships deepened over time. American companies invested heavily in Iranian industries, while Iranian oil exports became a vital component of global energy markets. Military cooperation between the two countries continued to expand. Iran purchased billions of dollars worth of American weapons, making it one of the largest buyers of U.S. military equipment in the world. The Shah believed that a powerful military would protect Iran from external threats and elevate its status as a regional power. Yet this partnership also fueled growing resentment among segments of the Iranian population. Many critics argued that the Shah's dependence on Western support made Iran appear subordinate to foreign interests. The presence of American advisors and the visibility of Western culture in urban areas reinforced the perception that Iran's leadership was drifting away from its own people. By the 1970s, these tensions had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Rapid economic expansion had produced both prosperity and frustration. Urbanization accelerated social change while straining traditional communities. Political repression prevented open dialogue about the nation's future. Religious leaders, students, intellectuals, and workers began forming networks of opposition that criticized the monarchy from different perspectives. The Shah remained confident in his vision of modernization and his alliance with the West, believing that economic development and military strength would secure Iran's future. Oil revenues surged to the global energy boom of the 1970s, providing the government with immense financial resources. Massive development projects continued, and the Shah spoke openly about transforming Iran into one of the world's most advanced nations. But beneath the impressive displays of wealth and power, dissatisfaction continued to grow quietly across Iranian society. Many citizens believed their voices were excluded from political life, and the memory of the 1953 coup still lingered in the national consciousness as a reminder of foreign influence in Iranian affairs. The monarchy's reliance on security forces to maintain control deepened the divide between the state and segments of the population that felt marginalized or ignored. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to Join Tio's space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. By the late 1970s, Iran stood on the edge of a transformation that few outside observers fully understood. Beneath the modern buildings of Tehran, beneath the highways, factories, and grand development projects built during the rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a storm of anger and frustration had been building for years. Many Iranians felt that their country had changed too quickly, too unevenly, and without their voices being heard. Economic inequality, political repression, and resentment toward foreign influence had slowly woven together into a powerful force of opposition. For decades, the Shah had ruled with strong support from the United States and other Western allies. His government had pursued modernization and economic growth, but it had also relied heavily on strict political control. The secret police, Savak, monitored dissent and suppressed political movements. Many intellectuals, students, and religious leaders felt that Iran's government had become disconnected from its own people at the center of the growing resistance stood a religious figure who had long criticized the monarchy and its alliance with the West, Ruhollah Khomeini. Years earlier, Khomeini had condemned the Shah's reforms and accused him of allowing foreign powers to dominate Iran's political and cultural life. Because of these criticisms, the Shah's government forced him into exile. Yet exile did not silence him. From abroad, Khomeini continued delivering speeches and messages that were secretly recorded and distributed throughout Iran. His words spread through underground networks of mosques, religious schools, and student groups. Cassette tapes of his sermons traveled from city to city, played quietly in homes, marketplaces, and gatherings. His message resonated with many Iranians who believed that the country had lost its independence and moral direction. He called for the removal of the Shah and the creation of a government rooted in Islamic principles and national sovereignty. Meanwhile, Iran's economy was experiencing dramatic shifts. Oil revenues had surged during the 1970s, allowing the government to launch massive development programs. However, rapid economic expansion also created inflation and social tension. Housing shortages, rising prices, and unemployment began affecting large portions of the population. Workers, students, and middle-class professionals all began expressing dissatisfaction with the direction of the country. The first sparks of open unrest began appearing in 1977 and 1978. Intellectuals and activists started organizing protests and publishing statements calling for political reform. Demonstrations slowly spread through major cities. At first, these gatherings were relatively small, but the government's response often involved arrests and crackdowns, which only fueled more anger. Towards an inevitable collision. Religious institutions played a critical role in mobilizing opposition. Mosques became places people gathered not only for prayer but also to discuss politics and share news about protests happening in other cities. Clerics sympathetic to Khomeini's message encouraged resistance against what they described as an unjust and foreign-backed regime. One of the most significant aspects of the growing movement was its diversity. Opposition to the Shah came from many different groups with different visions for Iran's future. Religious conservatives wanted a government guided by Islamic law. Secular nationalists demanded political freedom and independence from foreign influence. Left-wing activists criticized economic inequality and authoritarian rule. Although these groups did not agree on every issue, they were united by their opposition to the monarchy. As protests intensified, the government attempted to restore order through force. Security forces clashed with demonstrators in several cities, leading to deaths that shocked the nation. Funerals for those killed in protests often turned into even larger demonstrations, creating a cycle in which each act of repression produced greater public outrage. Throughout 1978, the scale of demonstrations continued to grow. Millions of Iranians participated in strikes, marches, and public gatherings. Factories shut down, government offices slowed their operations, and the economy began to grind to a halt. Oil workers joined the protests, disrupting the country's most important industry and weakening the government's financial stability. The Shah's authority began to crumble under the weight of these events. Although he still commanded the military, it became increasingly difficult to control a population that seemed determined to challenge the monarchy. Some officials urged the Shah to make major political reforms in order to calm the unrest. Others recommended harsher crackdowns to restore order. Meanwhile, Ruhollah Khomeini had moved to exile in France, where international media outlets were able to reach him easily. Journalists from around the world interviewed him, broadcasting his message far beyond Iran's borders. From his residence near Paris, he called on Iranians to continue their protests and reject compromise with the monarchy. Inside Iran, demonstrations reached enormous proportions. Massive crowds filled the streets of Tehran and other cities, chanting slogans against the Shah and demanding political change. Some protests included millions of participants, creating one of the largest revolutionary movements of the 20th century. The unity and determination of these crowds made it increasingly clear that the monarchy was losing control. By early 1979, the Shah's position had become untenable. Facing overwhelming pressure and deteriorating health, he made the dramatic decision to leave Iran in January of that year. His departure marked the effective collapse of the monarchy that had ruled the country for decades. Many Iranians celebrated in the streets, believing that they had finally overthrown a system that had ignored their voices. Just weeks later, Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran after years of exile. His arrival was greeted by massive crowds, welcoming him as the symbolic leader of the revolution. The atmosphere was filled with both excitement and uncertainty, as different groups within the revolutionary movement tried to shape the future of the country. Soon afterward, the political structure of Iran underwent a dramatic transformation. The monarchy was officially abolished, and a new system of government was created known as the Islamic Republic of Iran. The new state combined elements of republican institutions with religious leadership, placing ultimate authority in the hands of Islamic jurists led by Khomeini. This transformation fundamentally altered Iran's relationship with the outside world. The revolutionaries viewed the United States with deep suspicion, partly because of its long support for the Shah and its involvement in Iranian affairs during the previous decades. Anti-American sentiment became a powerful element within the revolutionary narrative. The revolutionary narrative. Iran, once a key ally of Western governments, now positioned itself as a revolutionary state challenging foreign influence in the region. The dramatic shift created anxiety among neighboring countries and alarm among Western policymakers who had relied on Iran as a strategic partner during the Cold War. Across Iran, revolutionary committees formed to reorganize government institutions, purge officials associated with the old regime, and implement the new ideological vision of the Islamic Republic. The country entered a period of intense political change as new leaders consolidated their authority and sought to reshape Iranian society according to the ideals that had driven the revolution. In the months following the 1979 revolution, Iran was a nation in upheaval. The monarchy of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had collapsed, and a new political order was forming under the leadership of Ruhollah Khomeini. Streets that had once echoed with chants against the Shah were now filled with revolutionary slogans celebrating the birth of the new state. The revolution had not only changed Iran's government, but also transformed the way many Iranians viewed the outside world, particularly the United States. For decades, many Iranians had believed that the United States had played a decisive role in shaping their political fate. The memory of the 1953 coup that removed Mohammad Mossadegh still lingered deeply in the national consciousness. Revolutionary leaders frequently pointed to that event as evidence that two foreign powers had interfered with Iran's sovereignty. After the revolution, these historical grievances became part of a broader narrative that portrayed America as a force determined to control Iran's future. The situation grew even more tense when the former Shah, who had fled Iran during the revolution, was allowed to enter the United States in October 1979 for medical treatment. For many Iranians, the decision was not seen as a humanitarian gesture, but as a sign that Washington still supported the fallen monarch. Rumors spread quickly through Iranian society that the United States might be planning another intervention similar to the events of 1953. Anger began building rapidly among revolutionary groups and student organizations. One of these groups, calling itself the Muslim Student Followers of the Imam's Line, began organizing demonstrations against the American presence in Iran. They believed that the American diplomatic mission in Tehran represented a center of foreign influence and possible espionage. At the center of their attention stood the heavily guarded compound known as the United States Embassy in Tehran. For years, the embassy had symbolized the close alliance between the Shah's government and Washington. After the revolution, however, many Iranians viewed it as a reminder of the political relationship they had just overthrown. On the morning of November 4th, 1979, hundreds of students gathered outside the embassy walls in Tehran. Their protest quickly escalated as the crowd surged forward and climbed over the gates and barriers surrounding the compound. Within minutes, demonstrators had entered the embassy grounds, overwhelming the small group of U.S. Marine Guards responsible for security. Inside the compound, American diplomats and staff members were caught off guard by the sudden invasion. Some employees attempted to destroy sensitive docket humans, while others tried to find safe places within the building. The students moved quickly through the offices, taking control of the complex and detaining dozens of American personnel. What began as a protest soon transformed into one of the most dramatic diplomatic crises of the 20th century. The students captured more than 60 Americans, including diplomats, military personnel, and embassy workers. Soon afterwards, several hostages were released, leaving 52 Americans who would remain in captivity for more than a year during what became known as the Iran hostage crisis. Images from Tehran spread rapidly across the world. Television broadcasts showed blindfolded hostages being led through crowds while demonstrators chanted revolutionary slogans. The crisis instantly became a global spectacle, capturing the attention of millions of people and placing the confrontation between Iran and the United States at the center of international politics. Inside Iran, the takeover of the embassy quickly gained support among revolutionary factions. Many students and activists believed they were defending their country against potential foreign interference. The embassy itself was labeled a den of spies. And captured documents were displayed publicly to reinforce the claim that American intelligence operations had been conducted from within the compound. The leadership of the new Iranian government faced a difficult decision. Some officials initially questioned the embassy takeover, worrying that it could isolate Iran internationally. But when Ruhollah Khomeini publicly endorsed the students' actions, the occupation of the embassy gained powerful legitimacy within the revolutionary movement. For the United States, the crisis triggered shock and outrage. Americans watched the unfolding events on television night after night as the hostages remained captive in Tehran. Political pressure quickly mounted on USA President Jimmy Carter to secure the release of the detained Americans. Diplomatic negotiations began almost immediately. But progress was slow and uncertain. The revolutionary government in Iran demanded the return of the Shah to face trial for crimes committed during his rule. They also demanded the return of Iranian assets held abroad and assurances that the United States would not interfere in Iranians' internal affairs. As weeks turned into months, the crisis began affecting politics inside the United States. The continued captivity of American diplomats became a national trauma, dominating news coverage and shaping public opinion. Yellow ribbons appeared across the country as symbols of hope for the hostages' safe return. The U.S. government attempted several strategies to resolve the crisis. Economic sanctions were imposed against Iran, freezing billions of dollars in Iranian assets held in American banks. Diplomatic channels involving international intermediaries were explored in hopes of negotiating a settlement. In April 1980, the United States attempted a daring military rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw. The plan involved deploying Special forces deep into Iranian territory to extract the hostages from the embassy compound. However, the mission encountered severe mechanical problems and a tragic accident in the Iranian desert. Several American servicemen were killed when aircraft collided during the operation, forcing the mission to be aborted before reaching Tehran. The failed rescue attempt deepened the crisis and further damaged relations between the two countries. In Iran, the unsuccessful operation reinforced revolutionary claims that the United States might attempt military intervention. In the United States, frustration and anger continued to grow as the hostages remained captive. Throughout the crisis, the hostages endured months of uncertainty and isolation. Some were kept in solitary confinement while others were moved between different locations to prevent rescue attempts. Their captivity became one of the longest diplomatic hostage situations in modern history. Negotiations eventually intensified through intermediaries, particularly as political changes began occurring both in Iran and the United States. Economic pressure and diplomatic efforts gradually pushed the two sides toward a complex agreement that would eventually lead to the hostages' release. The crisis lasted 444 days, profoundly reshaping the relationship between Iran and the United States. Diplomatic relations were severed, and decades of hostility followed as both nations emerged from the confrontation with deep mistrust and resentment, rooted in the events that had unfolded within the walls of the American embassy in Tehran. After the dramatic confrontation of the Iran hostage crisis, the relationship between the United States and Iran entered a long and tense era, defined not by direct war, but by suspicion, rivalry, and indirect confrontation across the Middle East. Diplomatic relations between the two countries had lapsed completely, embassies were closed, and communication between the governments became extremely limited. What followed over the next decades was a complex struggle shaped by regional conflicts, ideological differences, and the strategic ambitions of both nations. The early 1980s brought one of the most devastating conflicts in the region when Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran in 1980. The resulting Iran-Iraq War quickly became one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Millions of soldiers and civilians were drawn into a brutal struggle that lasted 8 years. The conflict devastated cities, destroyed infrastructure, and left hundreds of thousands dead. During this war, the United States viewed Iran through the lens of Cold War strategy and regional balance. Although Washington did not formally become a combatant, it quietly supported Iraq in various ways, believing that preventing an Iranian victory would protect stability in the Persian Gulf. Intelligence sharing and economic assistance strengthened Baghdad's position during the conflict, while Iran found itself increasingly isolated internationally. At sea, tensions between Iran and the United States grew more direct. Iranian towards targeted oil tankers moving through the Persian Gulf, attempting to disrupt the economic lifelines of countries supporting Iraq. In response, the United States began escorting Kuwaiti oil tankers through the region as part of an effort to protect international shipping. This confrontation at sea led to several clashes between American and Iranian naval forces. One of the most tragic moments occurred in 1988, when the American naval vessel USS Vincennes mistakenly shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing all 290 civilians on board. The incident shocked the world and intensified Iranian anger toward the United States, while American officials described the event as a tragic mistake during a tense military situation. Many Iranians saw it as further proof of hostility from Washington. When the Iran-Iraq War finally ended in 1988, both countries were exhausted and economically damaged. Yet the end of the conflict did not lead to reconciliation with the United States. Instead, the rivalry between the two nations continued through political pressure, economic sanctions, and regional competition. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, American leaders increasingly accused Iran of supporting militant organizations across the Middle East. Groups such as Hezbollah were believed by Washington to receive financial and military assistance from Tehran. Iran argued that it was supporting resistance movements against foreign occupation and regional injustice. These opposing narratives deepened the divide between the two governments. Tensions escalated further when the United States began focusing on Iran's developing nuclear program. Iranian officials insisted that their nuclear activities were intended for peaceful energy production, However, American and European leaders feared that the program could eventually lead to the development of nuclear weapons. In 2002, U.S. President George W. Bush delivered a speech that dramatically shaped global perceptions of Iran. In his State of the Union address, he labeled Iran part of an axis of evil, alongside other governments accused of pursuing weapons of mass destruction and supporting terrorism. The statement reflected the growing distrust between the two countries and reinforced Iran's image as a major adversary in American foreign policy. As international concern about Iran's nuclear program grew, diplomatic negotiations began involving several global powers. Years of talks eventually produced a major agreement in 2015, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Under this deal, Iran agreed to limit key aspects of its nuclear program and allow extensive international inspections. In exchange, many economic sanctions imposed on Iran were lifted. The agreement was viewed by many diplomats as a rare moment of cooperation between Iran and the United States after decades of hostility. For a brief period, there was hope that the deal might reduce tensions and open the door to a more stable relationship between the two countries. However, the agreement remained controversial within both nations. Critics in the United States argued that the deal did not permanently prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Some leaders in Iran also distrusted American intentions and feared that Washington would eventually abandon its commitments. In 2018, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the nuclear agreement and reimpose economic sanctions on Iran. The decision dramatically increased tensions once again. Iran's economy faced renewed pressure as international businesses withdrew from the country to avoid American penalties. Regional conflicts further intensified the rivalry between the two nations. Across the Middle East, Iran and the United States often supported opposing sides in complex struggles for influence. In countries such as Syria and Iraq, Iranian-backed groups and American-supported forces sometimes operated in close proximity, raising fears of accidental escalation. One of the most dramatic confrontations occurred in January 2020 when the United States carried out a drone strike in Baghdad that killed Iranian military commander Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani had been one of the most influential figures in Iran's regional strategy, overseeing networks of allied militias across the Middle East. The strike shocked the world and brought the two countries to the brink of open conflict. In response, Iran launched missile attacks on bases in Iraq housing American troops. Although the attacks did not trigger a full-scale war, the episode illustrated how fragile the situation had become after decades of hostility. Beyond military confrontations, the rivalry between Iran and the United States has also unfolded through economic pressure and diplomatic isolation. American sanctions have targeted Iran's banking system, oil exports, and international trade. These measures were intended to pressure the Iranian government to change its policies, particularly regarding nuclear development and regional influence. Inside Iran, sanctions have contributed to economic hardship, rising inflation, and limited access to international markets. Iranian leaders often argue that these sanctions represent collective punishment aimed at weakening the country's independence. In the United States, policymakers frequently defend sanctions as a tool to discourage activities they view as destabilizing. The decades following the revolution created a relationship defined by deep mistrust. Each major event, from naval clashes in the Persian Gulf to disputes over nuclear technology, added another layer to a long history of confrontation. Political leaders, military strategists, and diplomats on both sides continued to view each other through the lens of past conflicts, historical grievances, and competing visions for the future of the Middle East. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to Join 3's Space of Presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.